Black label, square bottle, the words Old Number 7. This bottle is recognized by anyone on the planet, even if they have never tasted whiskey. It stands on the shelves of bars from New York to Tokyo, appears in hundreds of films and songs, and has become almost as much a symbol of America as the Stars and Stripes. But almost no one knows the most important fact. The recipe that made this brand a legend was not created by the man whose name is written on the label, and the founder himself, a diminutive man just over 1.5 meters tall, died an agonizing death because of his own fit of rage directed at a fireproof safe. We will examine how an orphan from rural Tennessee created a whiskey that is sold today in every country in the world. We will show the man whose name the company officially erased from its history for nearly 150 years, and explain why the truth eventually came to light and turned the entire whiskey industry upside down. And we will tell you exactly what killed the founder of the brand, a cause so absurd that it is hard to believe unless you know all the details beforehand.
Tennessee, the mid-19th century. In a large farming family where 8 children are already growing up, another boy is born, Jasper Newton Daniel. His mother dies shortly after giving birth, his father remarries, and in a house that is already crowded, there is less and less room for another mouth to feed. His stepfather's new wife is already raising children of her own, and the unwanted stepson, who came into the world literally at the cost of his mother's life, becomes more of a burden to her than a child of her own. The boy grows noticeably smaller than his peers. Even in adulthood, his height will never exceed a little over a half meter. Perhaps that is why his character becomes sharp and hot-tempered. Throughout his life, he seems to compensate for his small stature with stubbornness and forcefulness in business. In his stepfather's house and large family, he feels like an outsider, and by the age of 6 or 7, he effectively stops being part of the family in the usual sense. He is sent to live first with one relative, then another, like an extra mouth that simply needs to be placed somewhere.
Before he is even 10 years old, he leaves home for good. Not in search of adventure, out of desperation. The boy finds shelter with a neighbor, a local preacher and part-time moonshiner named Dan Call. Jasper becomes his errand boy, chopping firewood, carrying water, doing any dirty work in exchange for food and a roof over his head. No school, no childhood in the usual sense of the word, only work from dawn until dusk for the most basic things. Not going hungry, and not sleeping under the open sky. It would seem to be the ordinary fate of yet another impoverished orphan of the pre-Civil War South, of whom there were thousands at the time. But it is on this very farm that the boy will meet the man who will determine the course of his entire future life, and whose name, a century and a half later, will return from oblivion and overturn the official history of the most recognizable whiskey in the world.
On Dan Call's farm, there is a still, and it is not the preacher himself who operates it. Behind the distillation apparatus stands an enslaved man named Nathan Green, whom everyone simply calls Nearest, the closest, the one nearest by. No one knows exactly where this nickname came from, whether because he was Call's closest assistant on the affairs of the farm, or simply because it sounded similar to his own name. But it was this name that stayed with him for the rest of his life, and later entered the history of whiskey. Nearest Green is not simply an enslaved man assigned to the barrels. He is a recognized master of his craft, a man who has perfected the technique that would change all subsequent production of Tennessee whiskey: filtration through sugar maple charcoal. It is this method, slowly, drop by drop, passing the fresh spirit through 10 feet of charcoal before pouring it into barrels, that gives the drink the distinctive smoothness that sets Tennessee whiskey apart from ordinary bourbon.
Little Jasper, whom everyone now simply calls Jack, spends his days around the still. Nearest Green, instead of chasing the boy away, begins teaching him how to choose grain, how to monitor fermentation, how to determine by sight and smell when the charcoal is ready, how long the spirit should drip, drop by drop, through the thick layer of charcoal before it reaches the barrel. There is, of course, no formal training of any kind. An enslaved man cannot officially teach a white boy anything, and in the documents of that era, this process is not recorded anywhere at all. But in reality, it is Nearest Green who, over the course of several years, passes on to Jack Daniel everything that he will later present as his own expertise. When the Civil War begins and slavery is abolished, Nearest Green remains as a paid worker on the same farm, no longer by force, but by his own choice, which in itself says a great deal about how strong his ties to this place and to the craft he practiced better than anyone else in the area had become by that time. And this is where something happens that is completely untypical for the post-war South, and we will talk about it a little later, because it is precisely this that will become the secret the company will hide for almost a century and a half. After a long legal dispute over his father's inheritance, Jack finally receives his share of the money. The conflict with his relatives dragged on for more than a year, and seriously damaged relationships within an already complicated family. With these funds, together with Dan Call, he opens an officially registered distillery. According to the company's own legend, this happens in 1866, making it one of the first legally registered distilleries in the country, although Daniel's biographers dispute this and point to a later date for the land registration, 1875. Dan Call leaves the business fairly quickly. According to one version, his own congregation and his wife forced him to choose, either preach the word of God on Sundays or make moonshine on weekdays, but not do both at the same time. Parishioners openly said that it was improper for a preacher to call for temperance with one hand while filling barrels of whiskey with the other, barrels that would then be distributed throughout the surrounding area. Full control of the distillery passes to Jack Daniel, still a very young man, just over 20 years old at the time, but one who has already managed in the course of his short life to go from an errand farmhand to the full-fledged owner of his own business.
And this is where 20-year-old Jack makes a decision that seems obvious today, but for rural Tennessee in the late 1860s was almost unthinkable. He officially appoints Nearest Green as the first master distiller of his distillery. A free black man becomes the technical head of production under a white owner, despite the fact that the war, fought largely over slavery, has only just ended, while attitudes in the South are very far from equality, and very soon those attitudes will turn into an entire system of laws restricting the rights of the black population for decades to come. This was not an act of charity, it was cold calculation. At that time, Nearest Green was simply the best master of distillation and charcoal filtration in the area, and Jack understood this perfectly. He had seen with his own eyes how the quality of the spirit changed depending on who exactly was watching over the still, and he had no intention of sacrificing quality for the sake of following the South's unwritten social rules. The gamble paid off. From the very beginning, the quality of the whiskey stood out from that of its competitors, and word of it quickly spread throughout the area and then beyond it. It would seem that this is a beautiful story about fairness and the recognition of talent, but reality would prove far more contradictory, far more human, and far less convenient for advertising brochures, and it would become the main turning point of this entire story.
Here is the central paradox of this entire story. During his lifetime, within the close-knit community of Lynchburg locals, Nearest Green's role was no secret to anyone. The people there knew perfectly well who had actually stood at the origins of the recipe. There is even a surviving photograph from around 1904 in which Jack Daniel is pictured together with workers from the distillery,
And right in the center of the frame, in a place of honor next to the owner, stands Nearest Green's son, George, who also worked at the distillery.
But when the company begins to transform from a local distillery into a nationwide and then a global brand, its entire official marketing story is built around a single character, an eccentric little man in a wide-brimmed hat and vest, a lone genius who supposedly invented the perfect whiskey recipe entirely on his own without anyone's help. That image was much easier to sell. A clear, complete story about a stubborn, self-made entrepreneur fit into advertising brochures and onto labels far more naturally than the complicated, uncomfortable truth about the partnership between a white owner and a black master distiller at the height of the Jim Crow era in the American South. For more than the next 100 years, Nearest Green's name appears in virtually none of the brand's official publications, none of its advertising campaigns, and none of the museum displays on the grounds of the distillery itself.
The gap lasts until the mid-2010s, when descendants of the Green family, historians, and journalists from major publications begin their own investigation, examining archival documents, tax records, and the recollections of longtime Lynchburg residents. The results of this work are published by one of the largest American publications, and the truth comes to light, producing the effect of a bombshell in the whiskey industry. It turns out that the legendary recipe, which one of the most recognizable American brands proudly promotes around the world, was created not by Jack Daniel, but by a black enslaved man whom the owner of the distillery could not even officially call his teacher during the lifetime of the generation that had witnessed slavery.
Brown-Forman, the company that by that time has already owned the brand for many years, faces a choice: continue to suppress the uncomfortable truth or acknowledge it publicly, risking a reputation that had been built for decades on a completely different version of events. In the end, the brand officially confirms Nearest Green's role as the first master distiller of the distillery. For the first time in almost a century and a half, it makes the corresponding changes to its own official materials, distillery tours, and advertising publications, while a separate memorial display dedicated to his role in creating the recipe appears on the grounds of the distillery itself. And then Green's descendants, together with an entrepreneur, launched their own whiskey brand named in his honor, which today is sold on the same shelves alongside Jack Daniel's and has already managed to win its own awards at international tasting competitions, including titles that had previously been considered the exclusive domain of large, long-established brands.
Here it is, the real and far deeper story of this whiskey. Not a tale about an eccentric lone genius, but the story of two families whose fates became intertwined almost 200 years ago, and a truth that fought its way to the surface for an entire 150 years, despite every effort by corporate marketing to keep it silent. But Jack Daniel himself, besides this hidden history, had another secret, a far more personal one, and it ended far more tragically.
For now, let us look at how Jack Daniel, having already become the owner of a growing business, turns whiskey from a local product into a brand recognized around the world. The first thing Jack takes on is the packaging. At the time, almost all whiskey was sold in ordinary round bottles, indistinguishable from one another on the shelf, often without any label at all. The buyer purchased the drink literally based on the seller's reputation rather than on the appearance of the container. Daniel chooses a square bottle for his brand, a rare, almost provocative decision for that era. The practical advantage is obvious. Square bottles are easier to pack tightly in rows during transportation. They do not roll around and break as often as round ones when standing on a store shelf or rattling in a wagon along Tennessee's rough roads. But there is another effect, far more important. In a display filled with dozens of identical round bottles, Daniel's square shape immediately catches the eye, and the customer doesn't even need to read the name. Recognizing the silhouette is enough. But the origin of the words Old Number 7 on the label remains a mystery even to the company itself. There are several official versions, and none of them is supported by documentary evidence. According to one legend, Daniel lost a shipment of 7 barrels of whiskey during transportation, and after finding them months later, decided to immortalize the number in the name. According to another, he supposedly had 7 girlfriends at the same time, and the number is a playful tribute to that fact. According to a third, an influential judge and family friend allegedly advised him to add a number to give the brand more weight, because just Jack Daniel's did not sound impressive enough next to its competitors. There is also a simpler version. The number 7 supposedly represented the number of distributor stores Daniel was working with at the time. The company has deliberately never officially confirmed any of these versions, and, strangely enough, it is precisely this uncertainty that has only fueled interest in the brand for more than a century.
Daniel's whiskey receives international recognition in 1904 when, at the World's Fair in St. Louis, the drink is awarded a gold medal as the best whiskey in the exhibition, an event the company still proudly mentions on its labels, because hundreds of producers from around the world presented their products at the same fair, and the victory of a Tennessee whiskey became a true sensation for the industry. By this time, Daniel himself is no longer young, but he continues to personally oversee every stage of production, traveling around his property in a neat 3-piece suit and a wide-brimmed hat, an image that would later become part of the brand's official iconography for decades to come. Contemporaries remembered him as a meticulous and demanding man. He personally tasted every new batch of whiskey and could reject an entire barrel if the flavor seemed even slightly different from what it was supposed to be. It would seem that this is the peak of success for an entrepreneur who is no longer young. But just a few years after this triumph, Jack Daniel will be destroyed by a story so absurd that it is difficult to believe. One morning, long before the distillery opens, Jack Daniel comes into his office and he cannot remember the combination of numbers to his own office safe. Inside are important business papers that he urgently needs. Daniel, already no longer a young man, and according to the recollections of his contemporaries, a rather hot-tempered person, in a fit of rage, kicks the safe with all his strength, even though under normal circumstances, nothing like this was typical of him. Colleagues described him as a fairly composed and polite owner. The blow lands on his toes and turns out to be more serious than it seems at first.
The injury takes a long time to heal. Daniel develops an infection and then blood poisoning. According to one version, the situation is complicated by the fact that he has long suffered from diabetes, which greatly slows the healing of wounds. Doctors of that time are unable to stop the spreading inflammation. Antibiotics do not yet exist, and surgical methods for fighting gangrene are extremely limited. Part of his leg has to be amputated, but by that point, the infection has already spread deeper. His condition worsens over the course of several years, and in 1911, after years of suffering from the consequences of a single kick against an iron box, Jack Daniel dies at approximately 61 years of age.
The founder of one of the largest alcohol brands on the planet, a man who survived the Civil War, the post-war devastation, and built his business from nothing, dies not as a result of a fight, an illness, or an accident at the distillery, but because he could not remember the combination to his own safe and failed to control a burst of irritation. Surviving recollections of his contemporaries describe him as a man who was polite and generous with his workers, but explosive in matters where something did not go according to plan. And it was precisely this trait, which may have helped him get his way in business for years, that ultimately destroyed him. He never married and left no direct heirs. Throughout his life, in his own words, he was married to his business. Management of the distillery passes to his nephew, Lem Motlow, a young man who will have to do more than simply preserve the legacy of his eccentric uncle. He will also have to guide the company through one of the most difficult trials in the entire history of the American alcohol industry.
A few years after the founder's death, Prohibition is introduced in Tennessee and then across the entire country. Legal whiskey production comes to an end for many years. Numerous distilleries close forever, unable to survive the ban, while their equipment is sold off or simply left abandoned to rust. Daniel's distillery manages to formally retain its license and survive this period, although production effectively comes to a standstill for years, and the company balances on the brink of survival, deprived of its main source of income for almost a decade and a half. After Prohibition is repealed, the company is revived and begins to grow rapidly, while the famous story of the stubborn little man and his square bottle gradually turns into a cultural phenomenon. In the middle of the 20th century, the whiskey becomes a favorite of Frank Sinatra, who, according to legend, instructed that he be buried with a bottle of Jack Daniels, a handkerchief, and some loose change in his pocket. Later, the brand becomes an inseparable part of rock and roll and biker culture around the world. It is mentioned in songs, shown in films, and gradually a simple Tennessee distillery turns into one of the most recognizable symbols of American culture in general, alongside blue jeans and Coca-Cola.
In 1956, the Motlow family sells the company to the Brown-Forman Corporation, which still owns the brand to this day, and over the decades has turned it into the second best-selling American whiskey in the world. And the distillery in Lynchburg, Tennessee, is still officially located in a dry county, a place where local laws prohibit the retail sale of alcohol to the public. One of the most recognizable whiskey brands in the world is produced in a place where its own products cannot officially be purchased in an ordinary store, a historical paradox that the brand itself points out with some irony during tours of the distillery, which today attracts hundreds of thousands of tourists from around the world every year.
Today, when you pour yourself a glass of this whiskey, you are touching two intertwined stories at once. The story of a stubborn, short orphan who built a brand worth billions of dollars and died because of a forgotten safe combination, and the story of a man whose name that same company erased from its own archives for almost a century and a half, until the truth finally found its way back onto the label. And perhaps it is this second story about patience, craftsmanship, and recognition that came far too late but came nonetheless, that is far more important than all the legends about the mysterious number 7 on the black label.